welcome to this episode of the Roast in the Ceilings podcast. Today we have with us a special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Leanna and I am an advocate, some might say, but generally just someone who cares about some of the issues that are going on in our world, particularly in scope surrounding feminism and politics. So I've garnered a TikTok community of over 14K and then also a Discord community where we talk about politics, conflict, and all of those things that are really prevalent in our lives. And so I'm really excited to be here with Maggie and Isabella to talk about just feminism.
Yeah, that's so lovely. You know what? I'm so glad you talked about feminism because that's what this podcast is about. It'd be a little weird if you didn't. But I'm so excited to get into this. If you guys are avid listeners of the podcast, you know that we usually go into a very specific area of feminism per episode. We really haven't had a time to kind of sit down and just discuss our thoughts on feminism in a long time. So I'm very excited for this and to hear your takes on this, Leanna, because I know that you post a lot on TikTok. Like you said, that's like one of your main platforms. Feminism on TikTok, in my opinion at least, has not been the most, let's say, out there, right? I've seen like the ideas on there are very mild, but like you don't do that. You do things a lot differently than what a lot of feminist creators on there are doing. Could you kind of talk us through that?
Yeah. So my feminist beliefs are what I would assume to be relatively centrist because, the core of that belief is that women should just be equal in every aspect of their lives, in opportunities, in law, in just generally having fulfilling lives, right? But like you said on TikTok, we see two very different spectrums of what feminism is. On one side, we have what people think are radical feminists, where they're very conservative and they say feminists should only act a certain way and should only include certain types of women. And then on the other side, we have, what people assume to be very liberal, very free feminists, and what some people assume to be mild. I would say that my belief kind of falls between those two. There are things that I agree with and there are things that I don't agree with. The things that I don't agree with are not necessarily, they're arguments in nature, but just how they argue it. And so that might be the use of language. Does it alienate people? Is it actually pulling people in and making them feel welcome and supported? Or are they actively trying to go out of their way to make it so that feminism is very restricted when it's not? Feminism should include everybody. And so I think my platform on TikTok is sort of aimed to create the sense of feminism that I would say is common sense feminism. Just for everyone, like humanitarianism. And so I think that's what I am trying to create there.
I love that. I think that so many times people are like, you're a feminist, and they don't want to get into it. They don't want to learn what that means. But by calling it common sense feminism, you're making it so accessible. I just love that piece. I wanted to say that.
Because it is common sense. Supporting women's rights is the most common sense thing ever, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's really shocking how some people have such restricted worldviews on what feminism is allowed to be. So when I talk about, women's rights being a global issue, some people just don't agree with me. And I'm like, why? And they're like, oh, but women can vote, women have rights. And I think their scope or their understanding of like how far feminism should go exists only within the global north and only within the borders of North America and Europe, where women do experience far more freedoms than they did, decades prior. But in a lot of areas in the Middle East and Asia, women are finding that their rights are regressing or their rights have never gotten further. And I think people fail to realize that. And it's just really shocking how some people don't care for it, even when they do find out that these things are happening.
That's definitely true. But how would you say that like the response has been? Like you're seeing this issue, you're seeing that people haven't been talking about this like they should. You're going on TikTok, you're building a huge platform to talk about it. How have people reacted?
There are definitely people who agree. There are people who ferociously disagree. And sometimes I understand it because what I try to do is I try to use language to elicit a certain sense of urgency. And we've seen common phrases like man versus bear. It's not all men, or it's not all men, but it's all women, right? And so all of these phrases are exaggerated to a certain extent, but their intention is just to have that sense of urgency so people care about these issues. The response that I see on, specifically TikTok though, is that people get really, really angry. And when they attack, my arguments, they're not really attacking its core or the debate fundamentally. They're attacking me, and then they're attacking like the analogy I might be using. So more than once I've heard people tell me, go back to the kitchen, or go make a sandwich, go do all of these things. If you really think you're better than men, just like go do this, that. And I'm like, that's not really the point. And that caused me to self-reflect on whether or not I should be using that language. And that's been really, really conflicting.
I love that you're bringing up this topic of language. It's clearly something you're passionate about, because like you know a lot about this, and I've never thought about this before, which is why I'm really glad we get to talk about this. What would you say, like, more passive language would be in feminism? Like you said, the way you talk is very like urgent. It's very like we need to like create action. How else? Like, what is the other like alternative that people are using?
I think the language that we should be using should be incorporating. So instead of just saying women, need rights, which is just true. The issue with these statements isn't that they're not true. It's just that some people refuse to accept it. And in reality, we need those people to accept these terms in order to be active participants of a movement that needs global awareness. So I think including language that includes people who, need to participate in this movement. For instance, saying, I recognize that women face these issues and these are how we should address it, but there's also like a men's issue. There's a male loneliness epidemic that people should care about, and instead of thinking they're unimportant, bringing that into the conversation and explaining that if we can solve this one thing, that actually works together and solves this other thing, but you just refuse to see that connection because you don't want to accept that you can be a feminist.
I love that point so much. I think like what you said is such an important point, that honestly, if we create equality for women, so many problems just are gone now. So many things just fall in line. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
So I want to ask you guys what you guys think should be done about people who don't feel like they're supported within this movement, even though we need that type of support. Like, what do you think we should be doing as a collective?
Oh my gosh. I think that is such an incredibly wise question that you just asked, because that's always going to exist in every space, not just feminist spaces. And that's something we talk a lot about on the podcast too. The subject of intersectionality and how can we involve every voice, because not every woman has the same experience. We all have unique experiences. And I think definitely what we talk a lot about is having different platforms bring on diverse voices and ensuring that each person is able to talk about their unique story without judgment, which is the hardest part, like you just said, the without judgment piece.
For sure. I think for me, it's kind of learning when you gotta compromise, okay? Because in my opinion, sometimes it is so easy to be, when someone disagrees, be like, it's not about you. This is not about you right now. We're not talking about your issues. If you don't understand it, you just don't get it. It's not for you. Because that's like the easiest reaction I have most of the time, when sometimes some people just don't get it. But like, honestly, I think it's important sometimes to take a step back and be like, you know what? That reaction does more harm to the movement in general, because that just annoys that person. Now they don't like me. Now they don't like feminism. So learning when sometimes it's okay to compromise a little and be like, you know what?
Yeah, for sure. What do you guys think about instances in which someone's opinions might differ from yours so much to the point that conversation might not be productive, right? So, for example, there are people who think one way about the feminist movement, and then there was this other person that I had a discussion with who said that women never wanted rights and that all women's rights were actually given to them by men. So in imperial China, when we had a matriarchal society, that was only allowed because men gave them the ability to. And I thought at that point, is it really worthwhile for me to be engaging in that conversation if he's not going to budge? So I guess the question really is, at what point do we draw the line at having these conversations when they're unproductive?
Honestly, I think drawing the line early on is so important. I think it's very easy to tell very early on in a conversation. You don't need to be sitting there for minutes to be like, hey, you're not listening to anything I'm saying. Honestly, I'm not going to listen to anything you're saying. So this is not going to be a productive conversation. Because again, if you keep wasting each other's times, you're going to annoy each other even more. Both of you are going to be more polarized after the conversation. So honestly, at some point when you realize you're not listening to each other, it's better to step back. And like you mentioned before, online spaces especially, it's so easy for someone to just comment, and you can't argue with a TikTok commenter. It's never happened before. It's never worked. You will never win an argument with a TikTok commenter. You're not going to change their mind. So honestly, in that circumstance, I just think you got to step back.
Yeah, I just want to add that, like, it's okay to be pissed. you know, we all get pissed all the
Yeah.
time, and that's okay, but we also have to recognize where the other
Mhm.
person's coming from. There's a reason why people think a certain way, and we have to take a step back and look at our own biases and why we are taking this stance, because there's
Mhm.
always some kind of reason in how we were constructed since we were kids almost. And I think that brings me to what I want to ask you, which is, it is so apparent that you are extremely passionate and you have well thought out all of these issues that you came on to talk to us about today. And I'm wondering what first sparked that path for you, what first motivated you to get into feminism, start observing these issues.
Mhm.
Right. I had a very definitive moment in my life when this became a thing. So I was in fourth grade and I read this book called Uprising by Sally Armstrong. And my TikTok followers know about this book because I talk about it so much. It's a highly recommended read, and it sort of documents how women live in the Middle East and in certain regions of Asia and how their rights are not really progressing. Perhaps for 9-year-old Leanna, that sort of was difficult to conceptualize. I just thought it was very scary. That was kind of all I knew. And it was in that moment that I decided I wanted to become like a Supreme Court judge to like change these things. I don't know. It was like an insane thought. And so I think it was in that moment where I realized that the issues that I face are far beyond myself.
Mhm.
The issues that I face are the billions of other girls who actually aren't as lucky as me. And so I think it was that moment in my life that defined who I would be and who I am now. And I still remember it because it sounds fake, but it is true.
No, first of all, that is so awesome that you had this origin story that was so important to you that you held on and remembered it. I love a good turning point story. But at the same time, that point you made about how all these issues are interconnected, I feel like it's such an important thing to say because it's so easy, especially for us living in North America, living in the Western world, where we are very lucky to have a lot of these rights that feminists have already fought for. To be like, oh, I understand that there's like people in other parts of the world who are struggling and who are still fighting for these rights, but like what does that got to do with me? But we really have to dissect that and be like the origin of their struggles and the small many things that we go through our day facing that we might not even see as sexism are connected. Those are caused by the same thing.
And I'm wondering, looking forward, in this amazing account that you have and these articles that we've seen you write as well, what are the things that you're hoping to go forward with? What is really driving you at this moment?
Oh, that's such a hard question. In an abstract form, I just want to be able to, I guess, help a world and create a world in which more girls are able to access opportunities and to find their purpose. And I think that's sort of something that you and we all believe in because we're all feminists, right? But in a more practical sense, I think specifically in Canada, what we could start by doing is first try to minimize the levels of domestic violence that we see in this nation that goes unaccounted for. Because on our equality index, Canada and Switzerland and all of these more progressive nations are really up there. But there's still so many underlying issues and harms against women. And I think we should start by tackling that and then perhaps see where we can go on in the future.
Do you still want to become a Supreme Court judge?
I actually overturned that idea in like sixth grade or something because I was like, nah, by the time I can even like qualify to be that, I'll be 80 years old.
Oh my
That's true.
gosh.
Everyone is so old. And I'm like, I don't want to be that old, I want to do something now. So yeah, now I think my general career path is hopefully to become a politician or something in that area where I can affect people's lives in a positive way. But that's always prone to change in the future. But I'm curious, what about you guys? Like, what do you guys want to do?
First of all, I would so vote for you if you ran for anything. As soon as we're legal to vote, I'm running for the ballot. Oh, what do we want to do? Honestly, I don't have a very feminist world changing answer here. I just wanna work in media. I just like doing this. I like talking to a camera.
Yeah, I think what you said about the domestic violence index is really important to me. I want to go into social work and public policy, so that is definitely an area that we align with.
And it's very cute.
I had this other question for you, and it was sort of on the topic we were talking about like 5 minutes before. But talking talking about this idea of how people outside of the movement might feel alienated and not want to talk about things to each other, right? Engage with each other. But what about the people within the movement who are also fractured? So, for example, very conservative, domesticized feminists, and then people who are more open to the things that we see in the 21st century. How do we think we should facilitate conversations between those different groups to create a more unified, organized movement?
That is such a great question. I don't even think you could put 10 of the world's best scholars in a room and they could come out with a definitive answer on that, because it's like what you said, like people honestly, like it's a human behavior thing where no one's ever going to agree 100%, right? I've seen people say you can walk into a coffee shop, you can be like, if everyone puts their hand up, everyone gets $100. There's going to be someone who doesn't do it, right? So I think putting these like polar beliefs in a trying to get them to talk to each other is gonna be so hard. But I think the most important thing is to be like, hey, there's a common enemy here. All of you guys face microaggressions, sometimes even worse, on a day-to-day basis. The small details are not that important here.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's so important that you're asking these questions about social discourse and how can we handle these situations because they're happening every day and it's always happening wherever you are. I think that like Maggie said, seeing the similarities that we have with each other, but also somehow being able to respect the differences. I think being trauma informed is really important. It's the first thing that came to my head because I think once you have those ideas and concepts, it's easier to have a respectful conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
I think too. It's so easy to just assume the way I think about feminism is right. Like this is what feminism should be. But I think you have to hold your tongue sometimes, even if it's so hard, and be like, you know what, your view on feminism is also a view on feminism. So we're both feminists and we're both fighting for at most points the same cause.
I absolutely agree with that. I think this sort of branches into this idea about how we can actually get people exposed to certain feminist ideas. So the first thing that comes to my head is like Emma Watson's speech, about employment, or Angelina Jolie's speech about how there's a girl like her in the world. And so my question really is, do you think celebrity endorsement or having those kinds of media is effective for the feminist movement?
Isabel, do you want to take this one first? Or?
Ooh, that one's interesting. Honestly, I think Maggie's gonna have a better take just because she is like
Media.
always into pop culture. Like she's always telling me the next thing with celebrities, and I'm like, who is that? So, but I think like personally, I think that it's a great way to spread awareness for sure. I think that like if I saw my favorite celebrity on screen talking about an issue, then I would pay attention. That's for sure. But at the same time, we have to make sure we're not activist performers because there's definitely a difference between performance and actually taking action on an issue. So I think those are two things to be aware of.
For sure. I think everyone could just see the way that my eyes lit up and I stood up a bit straighter when you asked that question. Guys, I love, like Isabella said, I can talk about celebrity drama for hours. But in my opinion, recently, like as you mentioned, all these speeches and even guys, the Barbie movie, come on, infusing feminism, even the most basic core feminist beliefs, women should be equal with men, into a mainstream pop culture, no matter how shallow it can be, no matter how performative it can be, which is bad, but no matter how performative it can be, it is normalizing it. Because I feel like, as we talked about before, it is so easy for people outside of this feminist group to feel alienated by it, right? To be like, oh, these feminists they're so radical. Oh my god, they're trying to change everything. And they get freaked out by it, and then they don't support it. But having it in movies, having it in speeches, having very popular people talk about it like it's nothing, openly talk about it, saying, hey, fighting for women's rights is not a crazy political thing. It's a normal thing. Like you said, it's common sense. Yeah. So in my opinion, having the more exposure we can get is going to help the movement by showing that feminism isn't scary and it's so normal.
It's normal. Oh my god, that's literally like the entire point. I don't understand. Sometimes I just don't understand when people think it's something insanely radical. I don't think it's radical to want to.
Because like sometimes you can tell someone, they'll be like, oh, what are you passionate about? Like, oh, I'm a feminist. And they go, oh,
feminism? Like, yeah, feminism.
Because I feel like throughout the years, feminism has had multiple different connotations. And this is going to go back to your point about language, right? And how that can both benefit and harm movements. the word feminism, everyone will have a different take on it based on like how they were raised and how their worldview is, but it's a very heavy word for a lot of people, even though the ideas behind it are so simple, right? Even because if you told someone, hey, do you think women should have the same rights as men? I would bet you that 99% of people would say yes. Like, of normal people, 99% of people would say yes. But if you go up to the same people and be like, hey, would you call yourself a feminist?
Yeah,
The number is going to shrink.
definitely. I think the issue has become that feminism has become synonymous with anti-men, or being more than men, being what men are now to women. And that's just not the case. Like, I think it was Emma Watson who said, or she was like, being a feminist is just being a humanitarianist. You just want equality for all people. And so I think we need to start by changing the way we talk about feminists and feminism itself, because when we perceive these people as overly radical, as overly emotional, that becomes an issue, and it stereotypes a lot of women, but also the movement itself, and that's on net a bad thing, which I think starts by how we talk.
For sure. No, I think you're completely right too. And especially on social media, it's very easy for trends to start going, the whole kill all men joke, the whole I hate my boyfriend joke, all these things where it can seem funny and simple at the time. I will laugh at them when it's on my For You page. But those kind of things do make people feel more alienated at the end of the day. They make people go, oh, like the feminists, they hate me. Like, and even the man versus the bear trend, like even though I thought it made such a good point, I think it should have taught people a lot. There were people going, but I would never do that. Why would you choose the bear over me? So like you said, I think it's kind of important to be inclusive in our language, just so we're not making feminism an even more scary thing for these people.
Absolutely.
This was such a great episode, and thank you, Leanna, so much for coming on. And I hope that next time, for our listeners, when you see the word feminist in our bio, or when you see the word feminist in Leanna's bio, now you have a whole new way to think about what the word means. So that's awesome.
Absolutely. Hopefully this is helping some people and changing some misinformed ideas, but then also reinforcing to some people that people with the same beliefs exist. And I think that's what's important.
Leanna, would you like to shout out your social media handles or anything at all for the last little bit?
Yeah, sure. So my TikTok is leanna.annalee, and that is also my email if anyone wants to reach out. And then my Substack and my Instagram are lzx.leanna. And so you can also contact me there and keep up to date with some of the articles that I'm posting about feminism, but also about politics in general. Yeah.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.